Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Axel Klein, and I will be moderating today's discussion in my dual capacity as the editor of the journal Drugs and Alcohol Today, and as a fellow at the Center for Biocultural Diversity at the University of Kent. Today's event is the first in a series dedicated to the relationship between people and psychoactive plants. Humans have co-evolved in close symbiosis with different zoological and botanical species. There's increasing recognition of our close relationship with certain key crops, usually tubers and grasses, that are important for nutrition. But we pay less attention to those plants that produce pleasure and change the way we experience the world. This series of webinars is dedicated to exploring the way different plants have been adopted, adapted, integrated into our culture, and with the emergence of a capitalist economy, commodified. Inevitably, this pulls us into debates around policy, health harms, and risk. Indeed, the journal Drugs and Alcohol Today is dedicated to finding ways of minimizing the harms caused by all substances that are currently classed as drugs. Our editorial line is that many of the problems that have been associated with drugs are a consequence of ill-advised policymaking. Ideology, zealotry, and self-interest tend to get in the way of finding effective solutions. In the case of tobacco, this is increasingly becoming apparent. The debate here is dominated by certain groups, and this is no longer merely the tobacco industry. One of the objectives of this panel and of tomorrow's panel is to give voice to some of the communities who do not always get a chance to participate in the debates, and to collect different perspectives. Now, Dr. Glover, you're the director of the Center of Research Excellence, Indigenous Sovereignty and Smoking in Auckland, New Zealand. I put to you that the intention of some tobacco control activists is to eliminate all tobacco use. I'm asking you, is this something that could be called another form of cultural imperialism?
Thank you for inviting me onto the panel today, and welcome everybody. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Hello to you as well. And getting to your question, absolutely it is. And I think in your video you were talking about, that's on the website, the globalization, and I particularly was listening to your video about Malawi, and you see the colonization that has around the world, and the globalization. Often tobacco was introduced to countries through that process of colonization, with the colonizers wanting to set up, the tobacco plantations, sugarcane, cotton growing, etc. So we definitely do see this cultural imperialism, and as you know, tobacco originated in the Americas, particularly in South America, and dates back thousands of years. As far as we can tell from the history, it goes back further than recorded history, put it that way. And many of the tribes in South America use tobacco in lots of different ways. I've just been amazed at the various methods of use, basically any orifice in the body, between the toes, behind the ears, anywhere where you could put tobacco in. And it also was prepared in many different forms. So smoking is only one way that people have used tobacco. Could also be eaten. They made a drink out of it, a paste that they would lick, and of course many of the pharmaceutical methods like the nicotine replacement products and the various ways people use nicotine today, the oral nicotine pouches or the snus, or I guess vaping is very innovative. That wouldn't necessarily have been around, so that's a new one. But many of the other ways in which people use tobacco, there's a precedent for that in how Indigenous peoples used tobacco in the past.
Yeah, one of my favorite methods of administration that I've read about is tobacco suppositories that were used in certain parts of the Amazon. But an interesting aspect of traditional tobacco use in the pre-Columbian Americas is the way it was integrated into social existing restrictions on access and use. So could we say that perhaps there was a form of harm reduction at work?
I'm not sure that it was really harm reduction. I mean, it was a very valued plant, and they totally. I mean, we're talking about people who have a very different belief system and very different worldviews. So the relationship of humans with plants, with the land, was different and based on a different belief system. So many of the different tribes, and not just in South America, but of course, tobacco was spread around the world and sometimes pre-colonial days, and it's been incorporated into religious beliefs, been honored as a god or goddess. So it's incorporated not just in social. We tend to think of smoking in terms of recreational use, but many tribes used it religiously or in religious practices, and also in healing. It was used a lot in healing practices and for healing purposes. And then, so not so much recreational, although there was obviously recreational use as well. It was used for hunting, for protecting the hunter when they went into unknown territory or into the Amazon. So there were just many, many uses and many ways in which societies constructed what it was for, the purpose of tobacco or that particular way of using it. And the other thing that was fascinating in the history is that it was traded, and they traded among each other. They learnt from each other, and the ways of using tobacco and why you would use tobacco was transmitted and around the world from tribe to tribe. And then, as others traveled, explorers, missionaries, whalers, sealers, so tobacco actually was taken around the world pre our current capitalist sort of globalized system, pre-tobacco companies.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, it's really interesting to hear that there's a spiritual dimension, but also to learn that it was used as a medical product for therapeutic use, which is counterintuitive to the way we're thinking about tobacco now, mainly in the terms of health harms. But these communities that first cultivated and discovered, in a way, tobacco, are they still part of the discussion on tobacco control today?
Oh, they've never been part of the discussion. I mean, I've been in tobacco control for nearly 30 years and been going to world conferences on tobacco or health since 1993 in Paris. And it was kind of like spot the other Indigenous person. And it's always been like that, unless, there was the Beijing one, I think in 1997. About 20 of us went from New Zealand, but very rare. And the other thing that characterizes tobacco control is the high turnover, so that there's no longevity. So I'm the longest standing person of, Indigenous person in tobacco control. And I've seen others come to a conference or write a paper, but there's no continuation. There have been some Indigenous tobacco control research centres established, one in Canada, one in Australia, I had my own one in New Zealand. And we all seem to live and survive for about the same period of time, and then funding was cut. So it's very difficult to build capacity and build knowledge from our particular worldview when you're constantly sort of, your funding is cut and or your centre is shut down. And
it's very sad to lose the voices, and we hope to reintegrate them through this process. But thank you. And now let me turn to Chifundo Kamwaza. Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us, Chifundo. You're a researcher at the Malawi Agriculture Policy Advancement and Transformation Institute. Let me ask you about another group of people who are central to the tobacco industry, the farmers. As we learned from Dr. Glover, tobacco was originally cultivated in the Americas. And for many years, the US, Brazil, and Cuba dominated both the market and the imagination when it came to anything to do with nicotine. But this has changed. In 2019, for instance, the US produced a total of 242,000 metric tons of tobacco. The countries of Tanzania, Zambia, and Zimbabwe produced 354,000 tons between them. So over the past 30 years, countries in Eastern and Southern Africa were systematically developed by the tobacco industry. And no country is more tobacco dependent than Malawi. Ms. Kalmaza, can you explain to us why Malawi has been called tobacco dependent?
Well, I think, thank you for that question. I think one of the largest issues we need to remember is tobacco is currently the second largest employer of the labor force, and this is with 80% of the rural workforce. So with about an estimated of 350,000 farmers that are growing tobacco on about half a hectare, as well as within the urban context is about 70,000 hired laborers and 10,000 leaf processing workers within the factories. So tobacco has been has been one of the linchpins of the economy, with maize being the other, whilst maize is mainly for subsistence. Tobacco is also one of the highest foreign exchange earners, with 60% of it contributing to that. And tobacco overall contributes 11% to Malawi's GDP. So already in that context, there's been a lot of reliance on it in terms of the economy, and that reflects down to the socioeconomic standing of most Malawians. Yes.
Thank you. So, and over the past few years, tobacco prices have been declining, and that must have really affected small farmers in Malawi particularly.
Yes, even with the most recent closing, there has been a drop of about 26.4% in sales revenue. So that trickles down to the farmers, with majority of them earning less than $4 per bale of tobacco that they grow. This is also a problem, as 5% of tobacco, or rather of our agricultural system, is given directly. The farmland is for tobacco production, and farmers have become slowly aware of this problem, with a recent study in about 2017, 2018 showing about 40% have been willing to move from tobacco because of the decline in pricing, as well as the decline in, or rather the increase in the rejection rate at the auction floor. So it's causing...
Usually, or is the threshold going upwards so that quality demands are becoming harder and stricter for tobacco producers?
I think the largest problem is input supply for farmers. They don't have, because we have, within the tobacco industry, we have two separate types of farmers. So what has occurred is those that are directly working with tobacco companies have the option of essentially receiving inputs as loans, whilst those outside of the tobacco system or the tobacco companies have to fend for themselves, per se. So this has resulted in less income for them because they have less profits, and then they're not able to produce, or they're not able to acquire as much inputs as they need, which has, obviously, as it goes on, is just a continual cycle.
Thank you. The Article 17 of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Controls calls for an economically viable alternative for tobacco workers, growers, and, as the case may be, individual sellers. Now, this is not the role of the World Health Organization, and so the convention passes the responsibility to the, quote, competent international and regional organizations. Now, Ms. Linda Savoya, you have led research on the experience, attitudes, and perspectives of Malawian tobacco farmers. And you've authored a study included in the special issue of Drugs and Alcohol Today. Can you tell us a bit about the efforts by international organizations to find or develop the crop for smallholder farmers in Malawi? Linda, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now, Doctor.
So I wanted to ask you about the efforts by international organizations to help tobacco farmers transition from tobacco to growing other crops.
There have been several. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. So we're experiencing some problems. Maybe Chifundo, you can step in there. The efforts by international or regional organizations to assist farmers in transitioning from tobacco. Unmute, please.
One of the more notable initiatives, I guess, that has been driven by government is the uptake in sugarcane production. One very good example would be the Green Belt Initiative, which was originally aimed at food security as a food security initiative, but because of government insistence or suggestion, it moved to having the market shift to sugar or sugarcane because of the EU and the US regulation leniency that happened, part of the Anything But Arms initiative. But that's not the only area that I think the government was able to, because tobacco companies, as I said before, provide inputs for companies or for farmers rather. It helps them with a stable market. So with a stable market, farmers are able to understand or to feed into the system more easily because there are faculties and avenues towards that, which is in comparison with those that are outside of the system or even those growing maize is not always the case, as the markets are less stable. In Malawi, we have...
Sorry, just to butt in there, but what you said, it was an initiative by the national government, and therefore the resources were not as generous as could have been if there had been support from the international organizations, the international community. And farmers, therefore, according to your research, are still inclined to grow tobacco because they have a more effective market system in place for them. Is that correct?
Yes. Because farmers will always seek stability in a market. So what has led there to be a potential shift to sugarcane is because of the EU and US markets having more leniency towards developing countries giving or exporting their produce, rather.
Okay, but what you were saying earlier, how tobacco companies that are involved in cultivating tobacco are providing farmers with seedlings, they're providing credits, they provide extension workers, and in a low income country like Malawi, they provide an infrastructure that is almost taking on a developmental role. They're taking on the place of government. And this is sort of ironic that the tobacco cultivation industry is playing this development role, whereas nobody else is doing this on this scale. But also tobacco has, of course, contributed to a lot of ecological damage in Malawi. Maybe you can explain a bit how that feels at the moment.
Yes, the ecological damage that's been caused by tobacco has mainly been from the harvesting of trees. And what we've noted is beyond the farming areas, if a farming area or tobacco area is near a national reserve, that area is harder hit with deforestation, and afforestation efforts are not taken up as quickly. So another problem with that is the tobacco companies have tried to instill growing or reforestation efforts, but because farmers see it as taking away from their main income source, they're not willing to do an uptake of that. So it's been causing a continual runoff of soils, as well as you find that we've created dust bowls in certain areas with about in 2018, the deforestation rate was about 2.5 because of an extended more farmers trying to get more land to grow on.
Thank you. So yeah, they're deep environmental and ecological problem as a consequence of expansive tobacco cultivation, again, with very little being done to address the consequences. So if little is being done to tobacco farmers, Dr. Nevin Kumar, what about the tobacco consumer in the global south? Mr. Kumar, you are at Yale University Sociology Department researching into how social phenomena can be harnessed to improve human health and well-being in different thematic areas, including tobacco consumption and sexual health. So for this article that you contributed to the special issue of Drugs and Alcohol Today, you scoured 6 databases and found 525 papers on tobacco control interventions in different parts of the world. Yep. And you found different contrasts. Before coming to these, I wanted to just go to terminology. What do you mean when you talk about the global south?
Yep. Firstly, thanks everyone for having me here. Global south is generally a term that is sort of used to replace previous terms like developing country and third world. And so these days people use either global south or lower middle income countries. So those are sort of interchangeable terms.
Thank you. So and there's considerable research on tobacco consumption in the global north.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
Can we say that there's a lot of research data on the global south?
Yeah, the data on the global south is quite minimal. I mean, over the years, the amount of research that's been conducted in tobacco control in the global south has been increasing, but it still pales in comparison to the global north. So I remember in the article, when you compare the number of papers in the global north and the global south in just 1 year, there is a significant difference. I think it's like almost like 100, about 100 or so difference in articles. Like you have about 500 papers in the last 5 years in the global north, but in the global south, there's only about 400 or so. And there are almost no like randomized control trials and things like that. So the amount of research is incredibly low.
So there is a knowledge gap.
Definitely is a knowledge gap, yeah.
That notwithstanding, can we still say that today the burden of tobacco-related health costs is borne by the global south?
Yeah, so that I would say is widely accepted. I think the majority of smokers are in the global south, and while overall the rates of smoking are decreasing, they are still fairly high. And I think actually 1 or 2 nations have recorded a very slight uptick in tobacco use prevalence among adults. I think Bangladesh is maybe a 0.3 increase over the last 5 or 10 years, but in general they have decreased. But this burden is still largely in LMICs or the global south. Yeah, that is true.
And I noticed from your research that many of the studies that have been conducted in the global south involve researchers from institutions based in the global north. So does that demonstrate to you that the governments in global south countries have no interest in funding research on tobacco-related problems?
Yes and no. One of the main reasons I think the research is sort of dominated by the global north is because funding is much larger. It's a much larger funding pools that originate from the global north that give an incentive to people in the global north to conduct research on these nations. Especially in the US, NIH is the world's largest healthcare budget of any major research organizations that's affiliated with the government. So there's a large incentive for people from the global north to do work in the global south. So conversely, it's not so much that the governments don't want to fund it in the global south. It's also to do with sort of lack of resources. There's so many other priorities, and budgets are strained in a lot of these nations. It's one of the main reasons. But on a second note as well, there isn't as much of a push also in a lot of these nations. Like as I covered in my article and a similar article we published just recently in Addictive Behaviors. A lot of these nations, there's severe there's severe lobbying by large tobacco firms that actually prevents or stymies efforts to engage in efforts for tobacco control in these nations. Like Argentina come to mind, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and so on. So yeah, there's a combination of factors.
And yet governments in these countries earn a lot of money from tobacco, either directly because they have monopolies of government-owned tobacco companies, or from taxes.
Yeah, definitely. So that's true. So in China, for example, if I'm not wrong, the world's largest tobacco monopoly is operated there. Most tobacco companies are owned by the government. A lot of it is grown by government-affiliated companies. Indonesia is another example, and Bangladesh as well. There's little incentive to some degree to actually increase taxes or to police errant tobacco companies, reduce advertising, and so on, when a large amount of the GDP actually comes from tobacco use, tobacco production, and so on. Bangladesh, I think there are large factories. China, especially, as I said, yeah. So there's reduced incentive, but governments are slowly sort of moving in this direction. The government also does do tobacco-related control activities, but you have to ask, if the large amount of their funding comes from the industry, or at least from their own homegrown industry, what incentive do they have to actually police themselves? So yeah.
Well, one of the participants in the panel, one of the viewers, is just sending in a question saying, asking about the tensions between the aggressive marketing of tobacco products by commercial companies, especially if these companies are government-owned, and the anti-tobacco or anti-smoking messages by governmental health departments.
Yeah. It's definitely very confusing, and I'm sure it confuses the consumer as well. Yeah, especially you see in like places like Indonesia, you still have tobacco-related messaging on the TV and so on, and some of it, I think in recent years, was actually aimed at teenagers. So if you have these things, and at the same time you have messages to people to quit smoking, I think it's not entirely certain like who the consumer is to believe, and you don't have anti-tobacco messaging that is sort of linked to things that people want. For example, you have movies, and then there's like the movie is brought to you by Sampurna, which is a major brand in Indonesia, but you don't have these movies brought to you by Indonesia's anti-tobacco body. So the valence of these messages is definitely very different.
I do wonder what kind of movies that would turn into, but yeah. I take the cue on the confused consumer to turn to Mr. Atakan Befritz. You are a tobacco harm reduction advocate and activist, the chairman of the New Nicotine Alliance in Sweden, and of the global umbrella organization INCO. If I put to you that tax income taken by government ultimately comes from the tobacco consumer, does that mean that the tobacco consumer is well represented by the government? Unmute, please, Mr. Befritz.
All right. Thank you very much for having me on. Greetings from Stockholm in Sweden. We represent the 1.4 billion consumers of tobacco or nicotine are represented approximately equally to Marawa's indigenous populations, i.e. pretty much not at all. It's non-existent. We managed over a decade to finally put together a transnational CSO NGO umbrella organization in order to become transnational, by which function you can become a speaking partner to the WHO, which you cannot do if you are a national. And that was pretty much the indications we were given, that if we do that, we will have access. No. So that was made abundantly clear at COP8 actually in Geneva in 2018, where we were 17 organizations standing outside the convention every day for 7 days. Nobody came and talked to us. Nobody did. Basically, it was a complete shut out.
So the consumer is effectively ignored. Are there any other forms of representation or inclusion in the debate on tobacco-related harm or on tobacco policy?
No, but there is a very efficient mechanism for exclusion, because due to the situation in Geneva with regards to the Framework Convention Secretariat and also the WHO, that is a license for tobacco controllers around the world, especially in the LMIC, to be rather aggressive against my colleagues working mostly pro bono around the world. That because Geneva says so, or because WHO says so, you are not allowed. You're not welcome. You're not allowed, and pretty not physically violently, but aggressively treated and excluded.
Well,
that's a very effective.
One of the tropes that has been used, or one of the way that the tobacco user has been cast, is as a victim of manipulation, by advertising, and then of course by the powerful addictive properties of nicotine.
Yes, so, demonic possession.
Demonic possession, very good. So do you think that, do you agree with that casting of the tobacco user as a victim?
Partly with regards to product choice, perhaps, but choice to use and dependence on nicotine, which for many is beneficial. For me, for example, no, that is it's a gross oversimplification and overextension of I think the facts on the ground.
Okay. So who should be speaking on behalf of the tobacco user? You feel you're not being represented by the by the WHO and the other tobacco control organizations who will say that they're speaking on behalf of the tobacco consumer who cannot speak for themselves because they have been manipulated, they are victims of demonic possessions. Plus, they will be speaking on behalf of, let's say, the victims of the family members and on people who could become users but are not becoming users yet.
I'm not quite sure I got the question here. Sorry.
Who should be speaking on behalf of the tobacco users? And do you feel that the WHO and the control lobby are the legitimate voice of the tobacco consumer?
Absolutely, unequivocally, no. In no way, shape, or form at all. It is. I think it's abhorrent the way it is framed, that we are incapacitated mentally to be, functional agents to speak for our own cause or our own health situation. And the easy answer to your question, of course, is as with everything else, those who do use, of course, must speak on behalf of those who do use. And that is exactly what we have in place with a functioning, as a global network with a democratic election of representatives to speak on behalf of those who have switched, for example, to less harmful products, and those who do not have a voice and are left with the choices given to them by their national governments, influenced by global policy.
Thank you.
So it's there.
So we find that a whole number of very important constituencies in this debate are being disenfranchised and excluded from the wider debate about tobacco regulation. Now, Dr. Glover, when you looked at the delivery of interventions aimed at smoking cessation or desistance, you found that these were primarily aimed at dominant groups. and something that is perhaps reflected in the shifting of the burden of tobacco-related disease. You were looking at the impact of smoking cessations on different groups, and we're using the term intersectionality. And that, again, in the name of clarity, I wanted you to tell us what you mean by that.
Okay, great. Yes, so in our paper, we looked at people with mental health conditions, members of the rainbow community around the world, and Indigenous groups. Now, one of the benefits of looking across 3 marginalised communities was that it really reveals how much of this is structural. But from when we talk about the dominant group, one of the big problems, and referring back to Navin's talking about the global north versus the global south, the disparities in research and focus, but very little is ever said about the dominance of the Anglo-Western worldview and knowledge system. So the Anglo-Western Academy, which is really spreading throughout the world now, that determines and lays down the expectations of what science is, what research is, what outputs look like, and what, for example, scientific journal articles must look like. And so that's one of the disparities, structural causes of the disparity, as well as the funding and all of that. Some of the research that marginalized communities or low middle income country communities do is not recognized as research. Similarly, work by Indigenous communities is not necessarily recognised as scientific research. So that's a big problem. In terms of interventions, again, because of the dominance of that Anglo-Western European psychology, particularly around behavioural behavioural change and psychology in terms of addiction, and what you and Atakan were just talking about, how the users of naughty substances are framed as having some kind of psychological deficit, mental deficit. And in tobacco control, we actually deliberately chose to do that, because if we could define the use of tobacco as a mental health disorder, surely people wouldn't want to have a mental health disorder. So there's just like decades and decades of this kind of appropriation of different psychological framings to create cognitive dissonance, all of the theories, many theories, but all coming from that Euro-American psychology and academy. I'm not sure that I answered your question.
No, you're giving us a lot of really interesting information, and one of the things that I think we discussed before, that there has been a shift away in the discourse, and it's gone away from reducing tobacco-related harms towards eliminating tobacco use. And what do you think has been lost here?
That's really concerning for me, because for Indigenous peoples who have been using tobacco in, as we said before, varied ways, very different methods, not always harmful, to move to trying to eliminate use of the plant in any way, in any form, anywhere in the world, there's no grounds for that. In public health, when I got into this work, and many others got into tobacco control, it was about reducing the method of use that was harmful. That's mainly smoking, and then of course in India, the harmful use of products which have tobacco in them and many other substances that Atakan and I have had a chance to have a look at, and he even tried some and burnt his tongue. So there's a lot of research around convincing people of how harmful any tobacco is, and what we know is that isn't true. Some forms or ways of using tobacco carry very little risk, if any at all, and keeping in mind there are many ways of using tobacco. And
Okay, thank you very much. Can I turn to you now then and ask you, from the research you've done, what is the evidence of tobacco harm reduction being rolled out in the countries of the global south?
Yeah, I think we are still pretty long away from actually, excuse me, actually having a large-scale tobacco harm reduction program in the global south. We haven't even got to the stage where there are large-scale randomized control trials for just tobacco cessation in general. So we haven't. We are still like a fair bit away. At least from what I did, there were about 4% of studies in the global south were around harm reduction. That's 4% of studies that have ever been done on tobacco research in the global south, like since inception. And within that, there are no randomized control trials. So we're still very, very far away from that. And to some degree, tobacco harm reduction may be quite beneficial in the global south because there are a lot of smokers who have been smoking for a long time. And a lot of these smokers, like the efficacy of getting them to quit through normal standard means has been pretty low, especially in China and so on. So I can see the utility of harm reduction in these scenarios. But I would say it's mostly for these sort of older smokers. For the younger smokers, there has been an issue with them picking up smoking. So I think that can be tackled with different ways. But overall, to answer your question, yeah, we are still very far away from any form of tobacco harm reduction in the global south.
But you know, we're looking at the way that knowledge is gathered, produced, and of course that knowledge goes to formulate the minds of policymakers. And if they have no information on tobacco harm reduction being even available as an option, then they will be driven in a very different direction in their policymaking. And it's an interesting example how that then reflects wider levels of ignorance. For instance, you found that in many countries, people believed that it was nicotine that was carcinogenic. Is that correct?
I'm not sure, but I think there has been some sort of misinformation around this. There's been some work. I think it was done by Wayne Hall a while ago, looking at nicotine actually has some benefits, but because there's there's such a competitive I would say sentiment around tobacco, a lot of these things have been, sort of ignored. So nicotine and stuff may have potential benefits, but we actually have no knowledge around how to actually harness it, or little knowledge, because there's so much pushback against tobacco in general. So you see the same thing possibly happening with cannabis also, where people are like, oh, we have cannabis use disorder, so that's why we shouldn't look at how cannabis can actually save lives or provide some sort of medical benefit. So yeah, I think we're at the point where we already have demonized tobacco, and we fail to see that nicotine may have any positive benefits and things like that. And there's very little research in that avenue.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to the confused consumer, Atakan, and ask, do you find that from your network and your knowledge of the situation from a consumer perspective in many countries of the global south, but also the global north, do you think that tobacco harm reduction products, information, directives are generally widely available? Please unmute. Unmute.
See, but as you say, I'm confused. No, absolutely not. Pretty much in the West, there is, beside the UK, which has a long history of not fighting the human condition, but rather going with the flow as best they can, which I think is a better strategy. Basically, you have the Swedish kind of tobacco harm reduction is banned in all of the EU, except for Sweden, which is insane. You do have a lot of pushback against electronic cigarettes up here in Scandinavia, whereas we do have the snus that is kind of exclusive to us. So when we checked, of 195 countries, you have 62 countries, I think, that just don't have any products whatsoever. And then the other one, in most of the other countries, it is unregulated, which gives you bad products, or it is over-regulated, which gives you bad products. And generally it's scorned. It's not seen as a kosher public health strategy, and you do not go to conferences if you are a pro-tobacco harm reduction tobacco controller.
Well, if there is this poor over-regulation or under-regulation, it requires thought leadership. It requires advocacy and people to to educate themselves in tobacco harm reduction and contribute to the debate. And I think there are different fora, like the World Health Organization, Bloomberg leadership meetings that help leaders to come forward and train and put these positions forward. Are any of the tobacco harm reduction advocates invited to participate in these sessions?
No, we are actively excluded from them as well. Absolutely. So you have the Non-Communicable Diseases Alliance, the NCD Alliance. You have the working groups of the FCTC. You have the working groups of WHO and the national initiatives. And to the best of my knowledge, we are not accepted to any of them anywhere in any country in the world. So the exclusion is pretty much 100%, I would say.
Thank you. I mean, that sounds pretty radical. And there are a whole number of very effective harm reduction products around now. Would you just mind walking us through a few?
Well, obviously, the best known that the whole controversy is about is the electronic cigarettes in different forms. This electronic cigarette that has a liquid, or you have heated tobacco products that is a little oven, or you have the IQOS, which is an inverted toaster, pretty much, that are all perfectly functional harm reduction products, with the obvious problem that you do not have 50 years of epidemiology until you have 50 years of use. Now, this is a problem that we solve with all other kinds of products by modeling. We do prospective modeling. We can give a very good indication of harms from other products. And we've done the same thing to the tobacco harm reduction products, and they come out at 95%, something like that, harm reduction, which is very good. But even the other ones, the traditional ones, for example, in India, most of those, you still have, compared to lifetime use, you still have a 90% reduction approximately compared to what you get in the smokers at the same rate. And then we have the Swedish product. That's actually the only product in the world that has 50 years of epidemiology. It has 250 years of epidemiology. And to the best of our knowledge, we do not have a single fatality ever. So there are really no serious adverse health effects whatsoever, which by definition means that according to the Swedish government statistics, we have zombies. We have people who are statistically dead that go to work, pay taxes, and go on holiday with their kids, which is sort of sad that we haven't shared that with the rest of the world.
We have a range of available products. We have a market. Yes. What's really missing is the regulatory framework, and I think this is one of the purposes of our panel here today, is help people make this regulatory framework and put it in place. And one interesting question that's just come up from Richard Proom, and this relates to ethical manufacturing and responsible sourcing, is wondering, are there ways in which vaping liquids can be produced from ethically sourced nicotine or tobacco? And are there any producers? Yeah, please.
I really have to weigh in on that, especially because of the contributions we have from Malawi. When you farm tobacco for either nicotine or for example, snus production, or as an oral tobacco production, there is no need for any fire curing or roasting of any sort. Regular sun curing is going to do the whole job for you, which means that whole issue, which is a huge issue, and it's also been very emphasized as a key issue, is gone. Just
potentially.
If you remove the if you remove the auctions with the bales where you control for the leaf sizes and the leaf quality and all of those things, because you are going to make a powder out of the product anyway, so it doesn't matter, then that problem is gone, yes.
Chifundo, do you want to come back to that at all?
I think there is a very thin line between thinking there's a one wonder fix to the tobacco industry in Malawi, especially if we look at the margins that farmers work with. So we need to keep in mind that it's very easy to disenfranchise farmers by removing these structures that have actually, in some instances, helped them. That's why we have seen an uptake in solidified markets such as charcoal production, which has also caused more environmental degradation. So I think it would have to be from the farmer's perspective on how can we assist the farmers to successfully adopt different ways of doing this, because as much as I think tobacco companies have adopted live barns where trees are grown to avoid deforestation of those areas. Those are traditional ways of processing tobacco that are indicative of the sun curing process. So that has to be addressed in terms of how can we provide farmers with structures where they don't feel like they have now lost the little power that they did have.
Thank you. Just come in there talking about alternative tobacco products. Let's also look at alternative commodities for tobacco farmers. We have already established that there are many disincentives for farmers in Malawi and probably in other countries in the global south to switch away from tobacco, precisely because you have this backup. You have an infrastructure set up. You've got seedlings, credit provision. Your product will be collected from the farm gate for you. All these are very important considerations for a farmer who has got very little reserves to fall back upon. So one of the alternatives that has been used, and you've already mentioned this, is charcoal farming and logging, which now accelerates the cycle of deforestation that was already initiated when many farmers switched to tobacco 20, 30 years ago. So we have this multiplier effect with huge environmental consequence. And we need alternatives. And I was again coming back to you, Chifundo, please. And if Linda is around, I can't see her now. She probably has problems with her connection. She could wade in too, though. Are the alternatives being explored, or are they being exhausted in your view?
I think with the way Malawi is set up and our reliance of tobacco, any alternatives that are being suggested or brought to the foreground are focused on how much stress it could remove from the loss of tobacco, specifically with the foreign earnings that are already in place. So the strategy that has been used to target particular commodities, such as I think it was in 2016 that there was a push for pigeon peas as well as soy to be grown because there was a developing market in India. So a lot of farmers went ahead and grew in place or replacement of tobacco, thinking that this is the new gold source that they're going to occur because there are already markets in place, that it's a guaranteed thing. But then coming to time of sale, the market disappeared. So I think as much as we have been trying to look at various commodities that we can go into, because of the reliance on tobacco so long, we have experienced a lot of I think you can this year as well, the legislation has gone through for cannabis growing. There's been an excitement because there is a perspective of the potential that Malawi could be earning, and that has been hyped even more by our neighboring countries also developing those markets. So South Africa has developed the markets, Zambia has developed or they're developing markets into cannabis growing or hemp production and the alternatives that could use. And I think the potential is there to assist in stabilizing things like the deforestation rates, because we have about 3,000 hectares of tree clearing that's happening at the moment, because it is a stable market. And that is also in part with the fact that Malawi is dependent on a hydro for our electricity, and that is not feeding enough to the general population, where 80% of the country is still reliant on biofuels. So that is our charcoal and our wood burning to achieve energy inputs. So I think looking forward, we need to look for products that address more than one issue. So we can't just looking at forex earners. We also need to look at solving some of the problems that have come through the past, such as deforestation, and not to put a fine point on the potential of hemp, because it has been touted to have possibilities of soil retention, which could solve some of the issues that we're facing in terms of charcoal, as well as export, as well as soil regeneration, to potentially go into various different commodities, such as maybe fruits, which we have the temperament for, but farmers have not been encouraged into that direction.
May I just to clarify, hemp production or cannabis production would enable you to produce a biofuel? How would that work?
Well, the thinking would be for specific hemp types or cannabis crops that have a higher fiber content, so that would be put into pellets. So the linchpin of this has to be the cost of it. The cost cannot exceed what is already being, or the cost for the average Malawian cannot exceed what is already being as the current cost for coal. So an estimation of a 50 bag is about $4. So whatever has to come in its place cannot exceed that costing, because then it becomes less attractive for the average Malawian. So if we can find a way of integrating the communities that are using a lot of coal burning to substitute for their incomes, and provide it at a low enough cost that it can be spread.
So I think we've just lost you there. If I can just continue from there.
Throughout the country.
If I just can come in, then thank you, Chifundo.
That's problem also.
We have a problem with your sound. I think one of the problems, and I think this relates to the policy objectives that we have with this panel series, is that we are experiencing tension between different international treaties. On the one hand, the framework conventions, which is strongly advising farmers to transition out of tobacco. On the other hand, we have the single convention on narcotic drugs that makes it very difficult for farmers anywhere in the world to grow any kind of cannabis product in the name of drug control. And we find that, and you mentioned it earlier, Atakan, the idea of overregulation based often on poor scientific evidence and combined with the precautionary principle. Thank you. I mean, we now have a number of questions that I wanted to address. Some of them are general, but I have a few very specific ones. So please let me take one to Atakan. And there are two to you about the FDA decision on the lower exposure of snus of harm going. Will that impact on the ban in the European Union? And is there any research being done in the EU to either strengthen the conviction for the ban or to generate arguments to lift it? Unmute, please.
So there is definitely research going on in Sweden and in the EU to strengthen the resolve to keep the ban. To the best of my knowledge, there is no officially recognized or sponsored or funded research going on to go the other direction. There's no hypothesis being experimented on to actually try to find a level of relative harm that would give regulators a tool by which they can measure snus against, for example, the TPD regulated vaping products that are around, that we use in the EU. That is under revision at the moment, but it does not look like there is going to be any change whatsoever in the regulations on snus. The fact that the FDA finally gave its clear for a full modified risk tobacco product designation, whereas IQOS a few months later got a partial one with reduced exposure. The Swedish snus, the 8 products from Swedish Match, got a full MRTP.
What is that? What is
that? I think it's actually it's disqualified as a nuisance. Okay. And the USA is a very, very different place that we have lot of connection to, but little understanding for, I would say.
We probably could say that is in many domains of life, not just health and product control. Marieva, may I bring you in on snus? Because it seems to me like a very particular product confined to a very small part of the world. And yet it continues a mode of tobacco consumption that was very widespread once.
Yes, the Sami who live across the top of the Scandinavia and in 4 countries, we suspect, and Atakan and I travelled around, we were trying to find information that the rates of snus use among them are higher even than the non-Sami population in Sweden, Norway, Finland, and in Russia. So I'm hoping to look some more into that. And that would be a successful model then of an indigenous group who have switched largely to, or they were using it before, and it's probably was because snus used to be quite dominant, and then the tobacco manufactured cigarette came in and displaced snus use, and now that is switching back the other way.
Yep.
So in New Zealand, we had an oral nicotine product. So these are new, and they similarly come from the same manufacturer in Sweden. So it's using a cellulose fiber and then putting the nicotine into that. It's still a little package, a little tea bag type product that people can put up under their gum. So we had that selling here, and probably up to around, the manufacturer suggested 10,000 people were then using it. I mean, you can buy it in a local convenience store. But we just had our vaping regulation pass very recently, and unfortunately they put it in black and white, absolutely concrete, that any Swedish snus style oral tobacco products and the oral nicotine products are banned now in New Zealand. That's a real shame. But many years ago, when Dr. Murray Logerson was looking at Swedish snus, and we advocated and lobbied for over 10 years for Swedish snus to be available to people in New Zealand who smoked, and we weren't getting anywhere. One of the arguments against it was, oh, well, that is specific to Swedish people, and culturally it's not going to be picked up, it won't be picked up anywhere else. Well, that's just not true. And it has, it can be, others can be encouraged to switch to that style of product or any other product. It's about whether or not the government supports it, so they give their approval of a product. Medical organizations and associations, they also say, well, we'd rather you use this than continue to smoke. And then it's the users themselves. They play a really huge role in in teaching others and modeling to others and in assisting others to switch to, as we've seen with vaping. It's mainly people who were smoking, switched, and then they have triggered this mass exodus of smokers to vaping. It wasn't public health. It wasn't the tobacco companies, because those products originated outside of the tobacco companies. It was the users, and they're the most important ones in terms of helping others come to a product. But it's not culturally specific. It may have originated in Scandinavia, but certainly could be picked up elsewhere, and I hope that it is eventually.
So I think this is a really important point to say that, yes, certain consumption patterns and maybe certain substances originate in culturally specific environments. But human beings are very quick to pick up on others. I mean, the spread of tobacco in itself over the past 500 years globally is extraordinary, an extraordinary testament to that. And people indigenize or culturally integrate new products very quickly. So to stereotype, culturally stereotype a product and the people and say, no, they will never do it because, is, I think it's racist. Sorry, Atakan, go for it, but demute.
That has been very, very carefully cultured and nurtured by tobacco controllers in Sweden. So I have numerous communications from them to me personally and to others, basically saying it is culturally specific to Sweden and Scandinavia, and we don't want to assist in introducing a new dangerous, harmful nicotine product anywhere else. And besides that, everybody hates it because it's disgusting.
But that said, and I take it on board, people are still liable to be influenced and manipulated. And you said yourself, Mareva, that the pattern of snus use was changed by the tobacco industry, heavily advertising, promoting cigarettes, and tobacco consumers switch from one product to another. So we can be modified and we can be manipulated and played with. So I think there's a lot of awareness, but I want to come to Chifundo and then ask her about alternatives to the cigarette as a tobacco delivery vehicle in a country like Malawi. Do you have anything that a tobacco user could turn to?
No, I think when we look at the devices that are available, such as the vaping and all that, those are not readily available to the average Malawian. And most of those devices that you would use, like your e-cigarettes, would have to be imported. And that's not something the average person can afford. So in terms of alternatives, I guess if we're talking about hemp, that could be an alternative for people who are trying to switch to, I think, what Mara called an evil substance. But other than that, not really, no.
So if I can come in there. If I could come in there, in Fiji, for instance, like what we are seeing, especially in the global north, with the very, very high taxation on tobacco. And so we are seeing, and as you would know, if you bring in prohibition or you bring in restrictions, people will find a way around them. So, for example, in Fiji, there is the manufacturing of cigarettes. There are many small farm holders in Fiji as well who grow tobacco for British American tobacco and on contract. But they also have their own tobacco that they grow for themselves. And that was very interesting. And again, it showed me that it wasn't always the tobacco companies that assisted with the transmission of the use of tobacco and the methods of use around the world. So in Fiji, it was the Tamil Indians who were taken there as indentured labourers by the British colonial forces. They took the Tamil Indians to not just Fiji, but Sri Lanka and South Africa. And those Tamil Indians took a chewing tobacco plant and they taught the people in Fiji, the indigenous people, how to grow the plant, how to prepare it, dry it, and prepare it for chewing. So, and that's chewing, it's not mixed with some of the slack lime and other ingredients that tobacco's mixed with in India. And again, similarly, that occurred in Sri Lanka. So what we're seeing now in New Zealand with the tax, our tax on tobacco is among the highest in the world relative to income. So in absolute terms, Australia has the highest tax in the world on tobacco. And we have a growing black market. So of course that's going to happen. We have people in New Zealand trying to grow their own tobacco and cure it and having to learn how to do that. We even had people who were importing leaf tobacco, but the government since cottoned on to that and closed that loophole. And there's just this constant strangling hold, you know, finding those loopholes, shutting them. And then we had this terrible phenomenon of robberies of convenience stores because we're an island nation, you know, a long way from our nearest neighbours, Australia, and very difficult to get the tobacco in via smuggling. Great border control here. And so the black market had to steal from within. So they started stealing from the local convenience stores. You know, incredibly dangerous, aggravated robberies, using weapons, you know, shopkeepers losing an eye, being slashed with machete, a just terrible phenomenon. And that's where you see policy creating another problem.
Absolutely. So there are good intentions perhaps behind certain policy, often a lot of zealousness in there as well, but the outcome is another set of harms that was totally unanticipated, and often people deny all the responsibility for it and blame it on something else. But this is of course always in highly regulated countries in the global north. I wanted to ask Nathan about countries in the global south and tobacco companies there who are not really developing the market for alternative tobacco products. And I was wondering, why do you think that is? And are they not missing a trick? Because in a few years, the established tobacco industry champions of the moment will perhaps have made the switch and transformed themselves into providers of other products and established these new technologies, established themselves in the market, and therefore and will therefore continue to dominate the market.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I'm not entirely sure why there hasn't been a switch towards vapes and other harm reduction products in the global south, especially since the burden is so high. I suspect it's because the push against tobacco products like cigarettes is not as strong as in like places like UK, US, and so on. So I think that has a lot to do with the fact that these companies have not made the push towards vaping. So in some strange sense, if you sort of increase the stranglehold on tobacco companies or on cigarettes, I suspect companies are forced to make the switch towards vaping for a range of reasons, right? Perception that their products now can be used for harm reduction, and it's a system that can be enhanced and can be done much longer. For example, everyone knows that cigarettes are close to their death knell. People in the global south know it. I mean, here in the US, they know it as well, but it's not that apparent now in the global south because the stranglehold on tobacco use in form of cigarettes is not as great. So I suspect that is the main reason why the shift towards harm reduction products has not happened in the global south. But at the same time, it's also very important that this thing happens, right? Because you have a huge bunch of adults, especially men, who don't want to quit smoking, and without things like harm reduction and a suite of other similar products, it's very hard to improve their overall quality of life. So it would be excellent if, along with other measures such as increased taxes, or sort of reduce advertising around tobacco, you also had avenues like harm reduction that could be added to the suite of tobacco control in the global south.
There is another argument, perhaps, which is that, and perhaps you've answered it already, but let me rephrase it, that the current regulations on tobacco controls are not being enforced. And this is a question that comes from Isaac, and he's asking what can be done about it. And then we have a similar question from Professor Rajesh Sharan, who is talking about India but also other low middle income countries, and he's saying that the implementation of regulation is not a major issue, and there are multiple conflicts in there, conflicts of interest. And what should the approach be, in your view, to deal with this situation?
Yeah, so at this point, there needs to be a large cultural change. This is something that people that sort of established in, especially in China. There's still a lot of doctors who smoke, for example. The rate of physician smoking is high. There's still a lot of people who give cigarettes as gifts. In fact, it's not seen as unusual, especially in second tier and third tier cities in China, to actually give your physician a gift of cigarettes when he's like, you perceive he or she has, or they have done well in their job. So there needs to be firstly a large cultural shift also, along with increasing proscriptions on tobacco companies. But I would say the cultural shifts are to some degree more important, because if people feel that cigarettes and whatnot are things that are heavily damaging their lives, their families, and so on, and things that they should quit, there would be less of a need for them to actually purchase these products. And based on that, the Chinese government could slowly shift their production of cigarettes away to other things, and use it for various other programs that could be more productive towards the well-being of the nation. So I think there needs to be a large cultural shift, but the problem with this is that a lot of the cultural shift needs to be pushed by the government. So it needs to be sort of a two-pronged method where like local communities sort of get people to see like, cigarettes don't have to be part of our culture. Cigarettes don't have to, be something we should give to each other. And it has to work in tandem with the government as well, which I think China has a lot of say over, because the government and the culture and the community are so deeply intertwined as compared to a lot of other nations with a high tobacco burden.
I believe
Axel, if I can come in on that.
Sure, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, when we're talking about a cultural shift, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that cultural shifts happen very, very slowly.
Yep.
And one of the, again, disparities that we have happening is that we have countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US, the UK, and many others that we've got our smoking rates down to a very low percentage now, 14, 12, 15%. And those countries dominating the narrative at the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control are held up as the leading models that all of these other countries should emulate. The problem that is what's forgotten is that it took us 50 years to get where we are, and it's been glacially slow. We're talking like 0.05% on average reduction in smoking prevalence over a very long time, over 2 generations even. Now, what we've got an opportunity for now with snus, although we have the historic barriers to snus in terms of the misinformation out there about it, but particularly we see it with vaping products. We've seen a rapid, just phenomenal exodus. If you look at Japan, they dropped their smoking prevalence by 30% in only 3 years. Now, that sort of rapid reduction you will not get if you talk about we need a cultural shift. That's going to take a long time. Bring in an alternative product that's greatly risk reduced, like vaping products, and Korea did it as well. The shift was so rapid, the government freaked out and began an anti-vaping campaign to scare people off shifting to, and it was their own Korean tobacco company had produced their own vaping product and heat not burn product. So the shift there was even more rapid than Japan. It can happen via this other model of introducing an alternative product that will get people across much, much faster than trying to get these cultural changes. And the other thing that's really unfair is to expect countries and cultures in the global south to compress the change and become like us, but become like us in a really rapid way. One, they may not want to be like us, and fair enough. And two, that isn't how it happens. These shifts are much, much slower.
Thank you. I saw Atakan nodding, but also shaking his head at some of what's being said. I think you want to come in there.
Yes, I wanted to correct a misstatement that I made, and that is what I meant when I said nurture the bans on snus is basically if you keep these products off the market entirely, as is now the case in New Zealand after the latest parliamentary decision, the discussion of whether or not it's going to be effective or whether or not it can be an effective switching method is moot. And that is exactly the point. That is why Sweden has done that. So the point of the exercise is to keep it at an apex level of regulatory decision, so that it's not available at all. And I completely agree with Marawa, with the addition that what you need is an alternative product with a whole package experience, pricing, information that makes it a better choice in every sense of the word for the consumer, a better choice. Because of course they will do that. And they will do it fast.
I think the experience from across the field of what we now call drugs, or that other people call, pleasurable psychoactive substances, goes to show that substitution, replacement, or shift to other products is the way forward, rather than going cold turkey. Or it also leaves a hole, in people's personal lives and also in social experience. It leaves a gap that will be filled by something else. We're coming to a close here, and I wanted to give everybody the opportunity to talk for a couple of minutes about what they would like to see coming out of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control and the follow-up conference and the Conference of Parties, and where to move forward, where you see us moving forward in this space of what is called tobacco control, though I never like the word control myself. I prefer regulation. And I wanted to start with Naivan. Maybe you could kick off on that.
Yeah, I think there needs to be much more research done in a lot of these global South nations, LMICs as well, around tobacco use. There's been a lot of observational studies and things like that, but I think methodologically we're still quite weak in the sense that we have very little work on using randomized control trials, for example, and now we have like a whole bunch of other techniques that computational techniques such as machine learning techniques and so on that have been used a lot to identify like what people are saying about tobacco use, what people are saying about vaping and things like that on the internet, and finding out like how these things actually move in China and how they are understood. So for example, in the US, we sort of know what people talk about in vaping and how these things sort of shift in response to COVID or the vaping crisis. Then we can sort of design policies to correct misinformation around vaping and tobacco and things like that. But we don't have any of these things or any sort of studies on these areas using these techniques in LMIC. So I think a major methodological shift needs to happen where we have much higher quality and much more sort of innovative work in these areas. Yeah, I would say that is a good shift ahead, in line with FCTC's the push on research. Yeah.
So from our researcher, we get a call for more research, which is perhaps not surprising. Chief Fundo, what would you like to see as we're moving forward?
I think it would be amiss for me not to put the smallholder farmers' interest at heart, because in most situations, I think we tend to put them aside and not incorporate their actual lives into the decisions we make for policies. So if we are transitioning away from tobacco according to international law, we also need to look at where these people are going and what avenues are available. So it would be a push to assist the transition period for farmers and also to have something to transition to. So I've heard a lot of talk about having alternatives such as snus. How, particularly for a country that is tobacco dependent, I would like to find out, how do we play a role in that? Because as much as there is a decline in tobacco, Malawi, to be honest, has not had the conversation of banning tobacco production. It's not something I think we're willing to have a conversation about until there's alternatives in place for the country as a whole, as well as the individual farmers that are existing. So I would like to see where, like as a researcher also, I guess, I would like to see more research in where can farmers go and what is viable for us as a country. Being as a Malawian, yes.
And just to ask you, and who do you think are the partners for this conversation? I mean, for the Malawian farmer, who are the international organizations, the fora that you would like to be more engaged with?
I think there is so much opportunities for the various organizations because everyone it's a large problem to solve with many issues. So when we're looking at the potential of going forward, we're also looking at issues of land, we're looking at issues of gender, we're looking at issues of nutrition. There is a lot to be dealt with the removal of one thing or the decline of one thing, that not one organization can take it on. It has to be a concerted effort, not only from international organizations, but also already, I think, as we have seen, tobacco companies within Malawi to take on the mantle of trying to decipher on what is the next step for the country and for its people.
Thank you, Wanda. What, Atakan, the consumer, still confused?
Always confused. Always confused. Well, from the consumer perspective, both my personal and also organizational, for us it's actually rather simple, because the FCTC has 3 pillars. It is demand reduction, it is supply reduction, and it is harm reduction. So we see one of the major problems currently is that only 66% of the treaty is actually in force. So, and having better acknowledgement of the harm reduction in the treaty that has no provisions for it, by which they sort of end up outside the treaty, we can do as we please. We can take decisions that are in line with international law, but that are more pragmatic. We can do that. There is room for it. We should do that, and that would solve a lot of the issues, we believe.
Finally, Mareva.
I'm sorry if you hear a beeping. My fire alarm thingy is starting to beep. Anyway, what I would like to see, actually, I'll tell you a little story. It's very funny. So we had our vaping legislation change here, and just a couple of last week, one of the most vocal opponents who fought tooth and nail for complete prohibition in New Zealand is suddenly a champion of vaping, and it's I guess a hope. We can have some hope that if we do get some change, we do get recognition, we'll get more and more evidence that's mounting, that vaping is greatly risk reduced, it is attractive to the consumer, it is an effective substitute, and they are moving over it without any encouragement at all. And if public health just get out of the way, we will see this mass exodus. Some of those people who are fighting really, really hard, a really dirty fight to have vaping or risk-reduced products banned and to not allow smokers access to them, they will switch. When they see that the success of it, they will switch. And I think that I'm going to hang on to that will come out, and that the Framework Convention, the all of those parties involved. I mean, it needs a complete overhaul. It's completely corrupt. The exclusion of people, the blacklisting of people like myself, of researchers and experts in the field, is just corrupt. So something desperately has to happen. Either World Health Organization has to be defunded, or it has to be overhauled. There has to be an international review of the Framework Convention Tobacco Control and get it back to what we established, what I was part of. You know, I was consultant, part of wording it. Everyone who was involved, it's gone way away from that. It is not about harm reduction or health anymore.
Right. That is a really strong note to end on. I'm very grateful to Maria for that. I'm grateful to all of the panelists. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Difficult hours for some of you. Thanks also for everybody listening, tuning in. That it's great. You will agree it's an exciting discussion. We also want to thank the Foundation for Smoke-Free World to help us and by supporting it financially. And I hope to see you all tomorrow when we have our second panel on tobacco harm reduction policy and practice, moderated by Dr. Sudhanshu Patwardhan and featuring Jed Rose, Derek Yap, Ricardo Colosa, and Patricia Kovacevic. So I hope to see you tomorrow, and thank you all very much.
No worries. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.